Watch a Gen X parent at the playground and you'll see something strange. They're standing right there, eyes locked on their kid, phone in hand with location tracking turned on. But 20 years ago, they were the ones who walked to school alone at age 6, who came home to empty houses, who survived entire summers with zero adult supervision. And now they're hovering over their own children like hawks, terrified to let them out of sight for 5 minutes. If you're Gen X raising Gen Z, you're living through the most psychologically complicated parenting dynamic in modern history. You grew up feral. Your kids grow up monitored. You learned independence through neglect. You're teaching your kids what, exactly? Safety or anxiety? Freedom or fear? Because here's what's happening. Gen X swore they'd never parent the way they were parented. They'd be present, involved, emotionally available. They'd protect their kids from the loneliness they felt. And they did. They absolutely did. But somewhere along the way, protection became prison. And now both generations are suffering for it. Let's name what nobody wants to say out loud. Gen X is still angry about their childhood. Quietly, deeply, in ways they don't fully admit even to themselves. They remember being 8 years old with a house key on a string around their neck, coming home to silence, making their own snacks, doing homework alone, waiting for parents who were working late, again. They remember the divorce rates of the 70s and 80s, the custody battles, being shuffled between houses, feeling like baggage neither parent really wanted to carry. And they remember being told to figure it out, to stop whining, to toughen up. Feelings weren't discussed. Therapy wasn't an option. You just dealt with it, pushed it down, moved on. 48% of Gen X parents now say parenting turned out to be harder than they expected. Harder than what? Harder than their own parents made it look. Because their parents weren't trying. Gen X was raised on benign neglect dressed up as independence, and it scarred them in ways they're only now beginning to understand. So when Gen X had kids, they made a promise. Never again. Their children would never feel forgotten, never unsupervised, never alone. They'd be the parents they wished they'd had. And that's exactly what they did. They became helicopter parents, constantly circling, always watching, ready to swoop in at the first sign of trouble. Here's where it gets messy. Gen X didn't just decide to be more present. They swung completely in the opposite direction. Their kids don't walk to school alone. They get driven. Or, if they do walk, there's GPS tracking every step. Their kids don't play outside unsupervised. Someone's always watching, always close, always ready to intervene. 41% of Gen X parents admit they keep parenting frustrations completely to themselves. They don't share struggles, don't admit when they're overwhelmed. Because to admit difficulty feels like admitting failure. And Gen X learned early that failure isn't acceptable. You just push through. But here's the psychological trap. By refusing to let their kids experience discomfort, Gen X is accidentally creating the exact thing they're trying to prevent. Fragility, dependence, anxiety. Gen Z kids can't make a restaurant reservation over the phone. The idea of calling a stranger triggers panic attacks. They text instead, or avoid it altogether. They struggle with basic social interactions that Gen X mastered by necessity at age 10 because nobody else was going to handle it for them. Therapists are seeing Gen Z in record numbers for social anxiety, for difficulty navigating conflict, for inability to handle frustration. And Gen X parents are watching this happen in real time, about how their constant presence somehow produced the opposite of what they intended. Let's talk about the thing Gen X thought they were fixing: emotional availability. Gen X grew up in homes where feelings were weaknesses. You didn't cry, you didn't complain. You definitely didn't need therapy. So when they had kids, Gen X became obsessed with emotional wellness, validating feelings, creating safe spaces, encouraging vulnerability. Their Gen Z kids talk about mental health constantly: depression, anxiety, trauma. They go to therapy. They use terms like attachment style and emotional regulation in casual conversation. They're fluent in psychological language their parents never learned. And Gen X? They're proud. This is what they wanted. Kids who don't suppress, who seek help, who understand their emotions. But there's a problem nobody saw coming. Gen Z's stress levels are through the roof. higher than any previous generation at the same age. 93% say they like spending time with their parents. 91% care what their parents think. But over half experience stress and anxiety daily. And those emotions mirror their parents exactly. When Gen X parents feel stressed, 53% of their Gen Z kids feel it too. When Gen X parents are anxious, 50% of Gen Z kids absorb that anxiety. The emotional openness created connection, but it also created contagion. Gen Z didn't just learn to express feelings, they learned to carry their parents' feelings as their own. Then there's technology, the battlefield neither generation was prepared for. Gen X remembers life before the internet, before phones, before constant connectivity. They had freedom because tracking wasn't possible. They made mistakes nobody documented. They grew up in private. They're Gen Z kids. Every moment is potentially public. Every mistake could go viral. Every social interaction happens under surveillance, not just from parents, from everyone. And Gen X doesn't know how to parent through this. They restrict screen time while staring at their own phones. They lecture about social media while scrolling Instagram. They warn about online dangers, but don't understand the platforms their kids are actually using. Many Gen X parents limit their Gen Z kids' digital presence. No faces online, strict rules about posting, fear of predators, of bullying, of permanent records. And they're not wrong. Those dangers are real. But here's the disconnect. Gen X thinks they're protecting privacy. Gen Z feels isolated. Their entire social world exists online. Restricting access isn't safety, it's exile. And Gen Z kids are watching their friends build digital lives while they're kept on the sidelines, wondering what their parents are so afraid of. Here's the truth Gen X parents carry in silence. They're exhausted, overwhelmed, second-guessing every choice, feeling judged by everyone. 39% say asking for parenting advice makes them feel inadequate. 47% hide their struggles, because every time they've opened up, someone made them feel worse. Their own parents judge them for being too soft. Their Gen Z kids judge them for being too strict. They can't win. And deep down, Gen X knows something's wrong. They gave their kids the attention they never received, the safety they craved, the emotional support they deserved. And somehow their kids are more anxious than they were, more afraid, less equipped to handle basic independence. The overcorrection failed, not because Gen X didn't try, but because trauma-driven parenting always misses the mark. You can't heal your own childhood by controlling your child's. You can't erase your loneliness by never leaving them alone. You can't fix what broke you by making sure nothing ever breaks them. If you're Gen X raising Gen Z, here's what you need to hear. Your kids don't need perfect. They need real. They need to see you struggle and recover. Make mistakes and apologize. Feel overwhelmed and ask for help. Because watching you push through everything in silence doesn't teach resilience, it teaches suppression. Your kids need boredom, discomfort, small failures, not because you don't care, but because competence comes from practice, not protection. They need to figure some things out themselves, not because you're neglecting them, but because that's how humans learn to trust their own judgment. And you need to stop trying to give them the childhood you didn't have, because they're not you. They're growing up in a different world with different challenges. Your job isn't to prevent all pain, it's to teach them they can survive it. The helicopter needs to land, not because hovering is wrong, but because everyone's exhausted. You from constantly monitoring, them from never being trusted. Gen X survived neglect and became fierce protectors. That's admirable. But protection without freedom creates anxiety, not safety. And both generations deserve better than living in fear. If you're Gen X raising Gen Z and felt this in your bones, you're not doing it wrong. You're doing it hurt, and that's different. This channel explores the psychology behind parenting patterns nobody else names. Subscribe to understand what drives the choices you make. And if you're living this every day, drop a comment. What's one thing you swore you'd never do that you're doing anyway? Let's talk about it. Because maybe we all need permission to land the helicopter and let everyone breathe.